Hey guys, today it is time for me to update you on my palette usage project. So every month I am keeping track of every single palette that I dipped into, and it's really cool to be able to see what palettes in my collection am I naturally gravitating towards using, which ones am I using the least. And so we're 3 months in. I'm keeping a playlist of all of my updates, but every update I share with you all the palettes that I used in the previous month. So I'm going to tell you every palette I used in March. I used a total of 14 different eyeshadow palettes, and I feel like we have a good mix of old and new palettes that I was using, so let's go ahead and hop in. I always like to rank them in order from my most used to my least used for the month. So my most used palette by far in March was the ColourPop Miss Bliss palette. The main reason this was my most used palette was because this was in my project pan for the month. I was just trying to hit pan on another shade in here, and I did successfully do that. So it's really nice to finally have a pan in this palette because I think I've had this since 2020, and I always love pulling this palette out in the spring and summer. I love warm, peachy, coral tones this time of year. I definitely use the corals, like the peachy coral side of this palette, more than I use the pinks. But there were several looks that I did with this. Some of them I just used this palette, some of them I paired it with other things. And then there were also some times where I used a different palette for the majority of my look, and then I just dipped into Palo Santo for my inner corner. But yeah, 11 uses on that palette this month. Then my next most used palette for March actually was a tie between the Elf Earth and Ocean palette and the Sigma Nomad palette. I used each of these 6 times in March. Unfortunately, this palette, Elf, recently discontinued, which makes me so sad because to me this is one of the best palettes they've ever put out. I used this quite a few times. Now, several of the times I used this, I know I was only dipping into the black shade to use as a liner just because it was the palette I had like nearby, and sometimes I like to apply a little bit of black eyeshadow over like a black liquid liner just to smooth it out. So that accounted for a few of the uses, but there were a few other looks that I did where I was just pretty much reaching into these shades only. I mostly stuck to the more earthy tone side. I know I did one look where I had rock bottom all over my lid, this really pretty olivey taupe. I love that shade. And then another one of the looks I did, I used these 2 yellow shades. That was the look I did in my March Everyday Makeup Drawer Get Ready With Me. I used this palette alongside the Hard Candy Envy quad, and I've actually used this palette already once in April. Oh, by the way, I'm not wearing any eye makeup today. I forgot to mention, it's kind of ironic that we're talking about palettes and I'm not wearing any eye makeup, but my eyelids are a little irritated today, so I decided to just give my eyes a break from makeup, and I just stuck to face makeup and a bold lip. Next we have the Sigma Nomad palette. I also used this one 6 times in March. This one I filmed a 1 week 1 palette with. I started filming that at the end of February and then into the beginning of March. So 6 looks total with this in March, and I grew to really like this palette. I don't love Sigma's eyeshadow formula. It's definitely not my favorite. I do have some trouble with some of the mattes just not blending really easily, but I found that as long as I set my lid with the matte cream shade, the other mattes blended really well on top of that. And I just really like the way that this palette is curated. I love the colors in here. I love the way it's laid out. I feel like it's really easy to come up with a look. And I found that there's a lot of different types of looks you can do with this. You can go really purple, very, bright, warm pinks, taupes, browns. Like, you can do a lot with this, even though it looks kind of monochromatic. There's really a lot going on in here. So definitely check out my 1 week 1 palette with this if you want to see some more looks with it. But this palette I received in January, and I feel like you can already see some good usage in there, which makes me really happy. A lot of the mattes have some dips in them, especially this shade right here. And a lot of the shimmers also look like they've been used quite a bit, so I had a lot of fun with that palette. The next palette is another new palette to me. This is the Odin's Eye SeaTalk palette. I purchased this actually in February, but it arrived to me at the very beginning of March. I used this 4 times. I feel like I used it more than that. It's funny because I think of this palette as one of the highlights of March. Like, I just really got into this palette this month, but I only used it 4 times, which is just funny. Sometimes I feel like, I feel like I enjoyed this palette even more than Earth and Ocean, for example, just in how many looks I did with it. But I think every time I used the SeaTalk palette, I was pretty much exclusively using just this palette, whereas with Earth and Ocean, I was often pairing it with something else or just dipping into 1 or 2 shades. But I'm loving this palette so much. I'm especially blown away by the shimmers and just the textures of the shimmers. Some of them you can see are like a lot more chunky, like this one. And I don't mean chunky like flaky necessarily, but they just have like bigger chunks of shimmer to them. And then some of them, like this shade Sea Spray, you can see it has a little bit more of like a fine shimmer to it. It's a little bit more just like pearlescent. Let me swatch these two. I wasn't sure what to expect with this palette because I know I've heard mixed things about the Odin's Eye formula, but that light blue you can see is a little bit more sheer, almost like a topper type shade, but I've also worn that like on its own as well. But then that taupe you can see is a lot more opaque, and this pink shade here, it's like a pink and blue duochrome. There's that one. Also has kind of a translucent base, but a really gorgeous blue shift. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with this palette so far. There's still a couple of shades that I haven't dipped into yet. Actually, these two, Electric Kelp and this bronze shade. But yeah, most of the looks I've done so far with this have been more on the cool tone side. But I really like that you can go, you know, more neutral, or you can do something really bright and colorful with this, or somewhere in between. You know, it's just a 10-pan palette, pretty small, but I think there's a lot you can do with this. So very happy with that purchase so far. Excited to keep playing with that. So another couple of palettes that I used 3 times. These are also a little bit more new to me. So first we have the Urban Decay Naked Smiley palette. I feel like I'm finally ready to share my definitive thoughts on this, and my definitive thoughts are I really don't like this palette. I haven't really liked any of the looks I've done with it so far. I've actually used it 4 times total since I got it, so I haven't used it a ton, but I've definitely used every shade at least once, and I feel like I've used it enough to know that I just don't like these colors, and it's partially that I don't really like these colors on me, but also I just don't like the way these colors work together. I feel like, you know, if you cover up the blue, it kind of reminds me of Naked Honey a little bit, plus the bright yellow. And I actually have to say, the one shade I do like in here is the bright yellow, but I have other bright yellows in my collection that also work well, including the Hard Candy Buzz Quad. I think that yellow performs just as well as this one. You can see they're very similar yellows. The shimmers in here are super dry. I almost feel like they're more dry than other Naked palettes have been in the past. And this blue does not play well with these other shades. Really, the best way that I've found to use that is just to pop it on the lower lash line and have the warm shades on the lid. I did do that once. I used a smudge brush to apply it to my lower lash line. I had to build it up so many times. I had to like really dig my brush in there, and it went on pretty sheer. I had to layer it up a few times to really get it to show up. I really didn't like the way that look turned out. I didn't think the colors were very flattering on me. I also felt like this Partey shade, this duochrome, it looks like in the pan a really pretty bronze and green duochrome. Kind of reminds me of the shade Tea Garden from ColourPop. Does anyone remember that shade? It was a single shadow from them I had a long time ago. I don't know if they still sell that, but it looked like it would be similar to that shade. But really, I mean, this is what that shade ends up looking like. There's hardly any green shift to it, and it mainly just ends up being this very orangey bronze. And there's already another just straight bronze shade next to it, the shade Spritzer, that, first of all, is so flaky and dry. But there's those two together. They look really similar. This is Spritzer, this is Partey. You can't even really tell that much of a difference between those two shades. And I don't really like that kind of color all over my lid anyway. I feel like it makes me look kind of sickly. So, you know, the mattes in here are fine, but the shimmers are really lacking to me in just pigmentation and texture. They're very dry, very underwhelming, so I'll probably keep it to share in like a fails video, but that's about it. I'm really not loving that. I decided not to even open the other of these mini smiley palettes that they sent me because the other color story looked even less appealing to me, so, and I doubt the formula is any better than this one. Now, another new palette that I am really enjoying, this is new from Nomad. It's the Royal Europe palette. This was also sent in PR. I really like the packaging. It's so fun. You can see, if you look up close, each of these colors is a separate layer of paper cut out. So it has a really cool like 3D effect. Now I do wonder how well this will hold up though, because you can see here some of the little pointy parts are already starting to kind of lift up. So, you know, it might have been good for them to put some kind of like protective coating over it, but I can appreciate an all paper packaging as well. Anyway, the most important part, take a look at the colors inside. Isn't this gorgeous? It's all jewel tones, and the top 2 rows are all mattes, and then the bottom row is shimmer, and all these shimmers are either multi-chromes or duochromes. I mean, they all seem multi-chrome to me. Now, I haven't used every single shade in this palette yet. Like I said, I've only used it 3 times so far, but all 3 of the times I used it, I really enjoyed it. I did one really blue and green look. That look I was wearing in my most recent empties video, and I really like how this palette is laid out. Also, you can just pretty much stick to one column if you don't want to think too much about, which colors pair well together. You have like 5 different super easy eyeshadow trios to work with if you want to stick to just one color family. But then also for that blue and green look I dipped into both of these 2 columns here. Of course, you can mix and match as many columns as you want, but I just think it makes it really easy to play around with color. But one thing I find really impressive about their shadows, at least the ones I've tried so far, there is almost no fallout whatsoever. The shimmers are amazingly just metallic and foiled. Oh my goodness. They're so intense, but they're not flaky in the slightest. I feel like a lot of shimmers, if they have this much color payoff, sometimes the side effect of that is that they're going to be a little flaky, you're going to get some fallout, but not with these. These are not powdery at all. So I just really appreciate that. I feel like, a lot of times when I'm doing a really bold, colorful look, I have to be really careful not to pick up too much shadow on my brush or else I'm going to get fallout. I haven't had any fallout with the mattes either, but they're also really pigmented, really blendable. I love jewel tones. I feel like there are not enough just straight up jewel tone palettes on the market, but I just love the whole concept behind this. All of the shades are named after different palaces in Europe, which is just cool. This palette is pricey though. I think it's $57, probably because it does contain multi-chromes. I know multi-chromes are expensive typically. So, maybe wait for a sale if this is really calling out to you, but I love this palette so far. Really excited to keep working with that. And then all the other palettes this month I just used once. So let's just go through those quickly. The first one was the Ace Beauté Floral Vintage palette. The look I did with this one, I think that was the look I was wearing in my video talking about how many years worth of makeup I own. I think I just mainly used the mattes in here, including the shade Cosmos. I really like that. I mean, I always love like a dusty, mauve-y lavender in my crease. That's one of my favorite crease colors. And I think I used this brown in kind of the outer corner and just to deepen up the crease. And then I think I also dipped into my Miss Bliss palette for that peachy shade all over the lid. I could have just used one of the peaches from this palette, but I was trying to dip into this palette as much as I could in March. I would say most of the time when I do an eye look, I'm dipping into at least 2 palettes, usually. I mean, a lot of times I do like to just stick to one palette, but often I'm, dipping a little bit into here, a little bit into there, just kind of mixing and matching, but really enjoying this palette so far. I just think it's a little bit too big. That's really my main critique of it, which, I mean, I should have expected that I would feel that way because it is a much bigger palette than I would typically go for. I really like the color story. I just think it could have been condensed a little bit. I don't think we needed all of these warm browns. I think we could have, curated a bit more, but I know some people like bigger palettes, so, maybe it's just not the palette for me, but I do still really like the color story. I also think the formula is amazing. I think one other thing I don't love about it, and this is totally a personal thing as well, there are actually only 6 shimmers in here out of 24 shades total. So that's probably another reason why I'm not, super into this palette. The next few palettes I used one time each. I actually used all 3 of these palettes together in the same look, and these are all 3 of my BH Cosmetics palettes. We have my Summer in Saint-Tropez, my Mimosa, and my Lost in Los Angeles palette, which is now depotted. I actually haven't used it yet since depotting it, but I do plan to use it soon. Just been using a lot of different palettes, as you can see, but some of these, as you can see, I used alcohol to moisten the shadows to keep them from shattering when I depotted them, mainly just the matte shades, but you can see it permanently discolored some of these shadows, which doesn't usually happen with alcohol. Normally it just completely evaporates and that's that. But yeah, I just left this weird kind of wet looking mark in some of those mattes. I think this rubbing alcohol I've been using, it's almost gone now, but I've been using it to repress things and stuff. I think this must just be a really cheap alcohol because, well, we bought it at Grocery Outlet. I don't even know what this brand is called. Collective Science Integration. I should probably stick to just more reputable brands for rubbing alcohol. I mean, it's just 70% isopropyl. The only other ingredient is purified water, so it's not like there are any additives in it, but I don't know, it smells a little bit different than other alcohols. Like, it kind of smells like tequila, and like most of the time rubbing alcohol doesn't smell that way, so maybe there's something wrong with this rubbing alcohol. I might not use that again in makeup. I mean, I think it should be fine. I don't think it damaged the shades or anything. Like, they still swatch totally fine. So I think, yeah, I mean, they're still nice and pigmented. So I don't think it's a big deal. I think it just kind of looks weird now. But the look that I used all three of these palettes actually was probably one of my favorite looks I did all month. It was very bright and colorful, and it was a multi-palette bingo. I did just a one brand palette bingo with my BH palettes for my March patron and channel member video. So if you want to see that, shameless plug, I'll link it below. That was a really fun one. I think that was one of my favorite palette bingo looks that I've ever done. It was very bright, great way to kick off spring. So all three of those palettes are some of my favorites for the spring and summer. Just some great, really fun, colorful color stories. I only used each of those once in March, but I do think these will be staples in my spring and summer palette rotation. A couple of quads. I used each of these once in March. The Hard Candy Envy quad. This is a really fun green one. This one I used in my March everyday makeup drawer, Get Ready With Me. That was the only time I ended up using this in March. As you can see, just been playing with a lot of different palettes, but this is a really fun green, like bright green palette. I was really impressed with the quality of this, especially because I felt like these Moods quads were a little hit or miss, but I do think this one, I got a really nice look out of it. The greens had really good color payoff. The deep green was a little bit sheer, but you know, definitely you could build it up to show up just fine. But I think for like $4, that's a really good monochromatic green quad. And then I think this is my favorite though. This is the Buzz quad. Like I mentioned before, the matte yellow in here is every bit as good as the matte yellow in the Urban Decay Naked Smiley palette. I mean, they both like have amazing color payoff. I definitely wasn't expecting much from this $4 quad. I didn't, you know, I think like yellow can be kind of hard to formulate because a lot of times it just ends up going on completely sheer or chalky, but that yellow goes on full pigmentation, you know, with a regular crease brush, it goes on great. I don't think I've done a look using like these two together, but I'll have to do that soon because I think they would make a really pretty pairing. Another favorite for the spring, this one I only used once in March, but I'm really looking forward to using it more in April. This is the Clarity Cosmetics So Amazing palette. Love this one. The time I used this, I think I did something peachy. I definitely used my Miss Bliss palette alongside it, but I did the peach all over my lid and then I topped it with the Oh Ship shade. Probably my favorite shade in the palette. It's just so sparkly. Now, I was talking about flaky shimmers. These are some of the flakiest shimmers I know, but they also are some of the most beautiful shimmers that I know. I feel like I show them every time I talk about this palette. I'm like, look at the shimmers! But like seriously, yeah, if you want like a wet looking glimmery shimmer, these are amazing. One of my favorite palettes for the spring, so hoping to get some more uses out of this in April. Then the final palette that I used in March was this little one. I only dipped into a couple of the shades in here, but this is the Ciate Olive 9 pan. Ciate sent a little PR package over. I had not tried any of their makeup before. The only Ciate product I've ever tried are their little nail stickers. So I was excited to play with some of their makeup. This little quad, I mean, first of all, it reminds me of the Huda Beauty 9 pans, very similar layout. Definitely think they're going for that sort of vibe. But I really like these colors in here. I like the warm, like terracotta mattes and then the olives. I think that's a really pretty color combo. The time I used this, I only dipped into a couple of the shades, so I'm definitely gonna have to use it some more and see what I think of it. But just from swatching it so far, the shadows seem to be pretty good quality. There's some of those olives swatched out. Let's see. Yeah, they look really pretty. So yeah, I love a little mini like pocket palette like this. I think it's just really cute, really compact. The packaging feels a little cheap. Like the hinges, you know, they aren't super smooth, but yeah, really cute little olive palette. So I will definitely report back on this palette, the more I use it. I also thought it would be fun, since we're wrapping up the first quarter of the year now, to go ahead and share my top 3 most used palettes of the year so far. So there are only 3 palettes that I've used 10 times or more so far this year. The first one is the ColourPop Miss Bliss palette. This one, all 11 uses were in March. Then we have the Sigma New Mod palette. This one I used a little bit throughout all the past 3 months, but the most uses were in March again. And then the other palette I've used 10 times is the Profusion Mauves palette, and that is another one of my oldest palettes. Now, I think it's important to note that all 3 of these palettes I wasn't necessarily reaching for organically. The Mauves and Miss Bliss were both in my project pan for a time this year, so that is the main reason I got so many uses out of them. And then New Mod, I was doing a 1 week 1 palette with, so 7 out of those 11 uses were part of that video. So those are my 3 most used palettes. Those I've used 10 times or more so far in 2023. Now my next highest number of uses were in my Nomad Verona palette and my Elf Earth and Ocean palette. So Nomad Verona I've used 9 times this year. I didn't use it at all in March, but I used it a lot in January and February. I did a 3 looks 1 palette with this, but then I used it quite a few other times outside of that. And then my next most used was Elf Earth and Ocean. This one I've now used a total of 7 times this year. So yeah, interesting little mix of palettes there that are my most used so far this year. Definitely not the palettes I would have guessed to be the ones I used the most, but a lot of them were ones that I was making an effort to dip into as many times as possible. So that is a big reason why, but I'm really curious to see how my usage continues throughout the year. Also, another thing I want to do, probably once we get to the halfway point of the year, I want to talk about the palettes that I haven't used at all yet. I might do some sort of either like chopping block type video where I decide if those are palettes I really want to keep if I haven't used them at all, but that'll probably be coming later on in the year, maybe the halfway point or maybe at the end of the year, I'm not sure. But let me know if there's any other content that you would like, surrounding palettes. But that is about it for today. Thank you all so much for hanging out. I hope you had fun. If you did, be sure to give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Feel free to check out the Patreon and the channel membership if you want to see that BH Cosmetics palette bingo I mentioned. And if you do sign up, you'll get access to all of my previous videos that I've done over there as well. So would love to have you over there. But otherwise, I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I will talk to you again very soon in my next video. Bye.